Greetings, it is time for another inflation update. And in this month's inflation update, we go to my familiar matrix where I have the usual 3 measurements on a 10-year window. The reason for having 3 measurements is so that we get a multi-dimensional assessment and no one can say that a certain index is rigged or a certain data point was cherry-picked or whatever. This is very comprehensive through 3 relatively unrelated indices. And we take long 10-year windows because that smooths out short-term noise and media-driven fear. So we take the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the US CPI, the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, and the 10-year US Treasury yield. And inflation is optimal when all 3 of these numbers are exactly at 3%, and inflation is higher than optimal when all 3 are above 3%. Why 3%? Because inflation is the fuel of technologies, and 3% is the level at which technology gets enough fuel to progress and generate more technology without causing too much hardship for the lowest income tiers of society. Now, if one did not care about the lowest tiers of society, they could say that inflation of 4% is optimal and some poor people will die off. But no, I don't choose that type of approach because that is not a humanitarian approach. But inflation that is too low is also extremely bad for all types of people. Poor people, wealthy people, everyone. Deflation is extremely problematic, and it's troubling how many people are out there now who think deflation is good because they have a very primitive, very unnuanced view of what inflation really is and what it isn't, and how if something they're buying rose in price, that is the greatest injustice of all time. But if something they own rose in price, or if their salary rose, then that had nothing to do with inflation. That was just their own excellence. Too many people think that. So let's go through these measurements one by one, starting with the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index. This is the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index from the S&P website, and the 10-year compound annual growth rate is minus 0.81%. Minus 0.81%. It is in deflation. And this is one index which is the most important for at least 2 reasons. One is that it comprises of freely traded commodities like oil, natural gas, gold, silver, etc. So no one can say that this index is rigged. Secondly, this is an index of commodities that are priced worldwide. Gold is priced worldwide. Oil is priced worldwide. Therefore, it has a comprehensive nature to it, whereas other indices are U.S. only or specific to one country only. Even the U.S. CPI that we'll see in a minute, that is U.S. only. And the other reason that commodities are the most accurate measurement of inflation to the extent one wants to correlate inflation with hardship is that commodities have a very, very minimal labor component. Therefore, commodity prices falling is almost always consistent with standards of living rising at the worldwide level, while commodity prices rising is usually consistent with standards of living falling at the worldwide level. A few oil exporters making a lot of money at the expense of the rest of the world is still a net poverty increase for the rest of the world, a prosperity decrease. Services inflation is not included in the commodity index, and rightly so, because that is very ambiguous about whether it is good or bad. If there's service price inflation, that means you might be paying more for a service, but if you're a service provider, your salary rose. So service price inflation is simultaneous with wage increases, and therefore the 2 are not easily separable in terms of what is good, what is bad. People compartmentalize this in their minds by saying, well, if service prices rose, that's terrible, but if my salary increased, that's not inflation. I deserved it, and that is an unmitigated good. If the person who pays me has to pay more, then no, I'm going to change the subject to something else. That's what they do. So now we go to the next measurement, the 10-year U.S. Treasury yield. 10-year U.S. Treasury yield, 4.71%, so that is well above 3%. This is high because the Federal Reserve and other central banks of the world are tightening. They're deprinting money. They should not be deprinting money for reasons I explain all over this channel. But because this is high, this is very, very negative for real estate prices. But it is 4.71%. That is higher than it's been for most of the last decade, but it's low relative to the 1970s, 1980s, even 1990s. So now we proceed to the third measurement, the US CPI. This is the BLS.gov website, and the US CPI is an index that we can see here. And the 10-year compound annual growth rate is the difference between what the index measurement is now versus what it was 10 years ago, and then dividing that into factors of 10, the 10th root of this differential. And I'll have a table in a minute that displays that in detail. But you can take any time window you want to see what the general trend has been. 1 month, 2 month, 3 month, 6 month, and 12 month. So as you can see, there was a spike of inflation that ended more than a year ago, and since that time, things are back down to the cruise control speed of 2 to 3%. So now we'll look at this CPI data in a table that provides additional clarity. This table is merely that BLS.gov CPI index formulated in a way that gives you an annualized growth rate for whatever time window you're looking for, which means obviously 1 month inflation has to be to the 12th power, 2 months to the 6th power, 3 months to the 4th power, 6 months square, and so forth. The same goes for windows longer than 1 year. 2 years has to be a square root, 3 years have to be a cube root, and so forth. The 1 year inflation, which some people think is the only measurement that matters, except that they don't say that when the number is not high enough for them to whine, is 3.7%. But the 10-year inflation window is only 2.8%, and this is the one that we are looking at for the purposes of my table, because we want to smooth out all this noise and recognize not just the distortion from COVID-19 central bank printing, but what the mega trends are. It's very analogous to how a person has to rise to a certain elevation before they can see the curvature of the earth. And I've also added this row for greater perspective since January 1st, 2001. So the entirety of the 21st century, the average annual inflation rate is 2.5%. So now we go back to my matrix. So we saw all three measurements, the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the US CPI, the 10-year compound annual growth rate of the Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, and the 10-year US Treasury yield. And the results were 2.8% for the US CPI. It is getting close to 3%, but it has not crossed 3% yet. And remember, 3% would be optimal. Only above 3% would start to become high. The Goldman Sachs Commodity Index, this is in deflation. This is very far from 3% growth. The technonomic medium of the world increases commodity supplies or increases the adaptability of alternatives to commodities faster than commodity demand can rise, and that's why this is in deflation. That's why oil prices are much lower than they were even 12 years ago. Gold prices are about the same as they were 10 years ago. Only the US Treasury yield is above 3%. It's at 4.71%. So this one is high, but these other two are not high. And like I said, I need all three of these to be above 3% before I say inflation is structurally high. Now we're going to look at some other data for a bit of fun. This is from CNBC, and it's speaking about just the recent month, September 2023 inflation. Now that is way too short of a window, but when inflation was high, the people who were extremely committed to pretending that inflation is super high were out in force, and now those people are nowhere to be found. They left all sorts of ignorant comments over here, but they will never show up here now, because look at what is happening with certain types of food, energy, and other necessities. Which type of food fell the most? Eggs. In just 1 month, down 14.5%. There was a tremendous amount of hysteria when eggs briefly spiked in price for 1 month. 1 month, which was February of 2023. And people acted like the world was about to end, and they're still complaining about it. 9 months later, they're still complaining about how they were inconvenienced in February of 2023 because egg prices became high. I mean, how long are they going to complain about that? What next? They're going to complain that when they were 11, another 11-year-old child called them a bad word, and that still is bothering them to this day? Because this is almost that bad. And then you see other things that fell. Number 3 is butter. Now, I did a video analyzing the illogic of the egg situation up here in the tag in this upper right-hand corner. But then when you look at number 3 on this list, butter, that was another thing that was causing hysteria. People were losing their minds because the price of butter supposedly rose. And the question was, how much of your income is really spent on butter? Does the price of butter really matter that much to you? So I did an entire analysis of the butter situation and the pricing and the supply-demand dynamics of that in this video up here in the upper right-hand corner in that tag you see. So you can go down the list. Further down here, energy. 2 major types of energy have fallen in price. Utility natural gas service has fallen right before winter. That's quite timely. That's good. Fuel oil has fallen, minus 5.1%. The fact that they can fall before winter means the structural deflation is actually higher than it seems, which means that by April or May they will be very low in price. And then health insurance has fallen by 37.3%. Now, the U.S. health insurance market is very fragmented, and a situation that applies to one person may not apply to their neighbor at all. But the fact that this can go down is very, very substantial. This went down by a huge percentage. Now, so many people have lost their minds on the subject of inflation that they will reject any good news out of hand. They'll use anecdotes to say, I know someone who knew someone who knew someone who lost a lot of money because of health insurance costs 10 years ago, as if that affects this data in this particular month, which was much more recent. And all these other things have gone down in price. So a lot of things are falling in price because inflation is structurally trending down, as we saw. And it's certainly not high if you actually care to look at the data and are interested in accuracy rather than nihilism and a victim mentality. Because on this channel, we look at data and see what the conclusions are from there, rather than try to get into a fad-based narrative, especially when we live in an age where pessimism and victim mentality is considered a virtue. And that's why you can see this video up here in the upper right-hand corner, which is a three-part series of how conservatives and libertarians have utterly lost their mind on the subject of inflation. Inflation has become to conservatives and libertarians what climate change has become to the left. If you like this type of content, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel, and thank you very much for watching. Technological singularity, Elon Musk, Tesla, inflation, Ray Kurzweil, Federal Reserve, inflation, hyperinflation, artificial intelligence, AI, Elon Musk, Tesla, Ray Kurzweil, technological singularity, universal basic income, technological disruption.